I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com with in-depth reporting and other resources for stories affecting San Antonio and Bexar County. While San Antonio lawmakers have taken a much more friendly approach to e-scooters than they did in the past to rideshare companies, many Alamo City residents have now come to question whether electric scooters are good for the city. And I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News staff writer Bruce Selcraig to discuss his research into e-scooter safety in San Antonio and also across the country. So Bruce, thank you for joining me today here on the podcast. Before we get to the rise of e-scooters in San Antonio specifically, let's talk a bit nationally. How have e-scooters rolled out across the United States, both with fleets of scooters showing up in cities across the country, as well as a handful of class action lawsuits?
Well, these e-scooters, as they're called, or in official parlance, dockless vehicles, they began to show up in earnest last summer, around June. They had been in California previous to that, but really in the summer is when they began showing up around the country, and that's when they began showing up in San Antonio. It's hard to get any figures for exactly how many there are nationwide, but they've shown up in over 200 cities and college campuses, and have gotten varying reactions in those cities. There are now many lawsuits. There are at least 5. I just heard of one today out of San Diego, so that would make 6 class action lawsuits. Every one I know about is out of California. That is a class action variety. There are personal injury lawsuits brewing in Texas and Florida, and probably many others around the country, but I haven't done a full, index of the whole country. But they definitely have some similarities, and a lot of the cases are built around the allegations that the scooters themselves have faulty components, everything from bad brakes to steering columns that break, boards that actually break in half as you're riding on them, throttles that stick, things like that. And complaints about the wheels, they're solid core as opposed to inflatable wheels. That makes them harder to handle. And just the design of scooters, they're not particularly safe, much less stable than a bicycle. And because of where your body is placed on a scooter, when you're going 15 miles an hour on little tires, if they hit a pothole, you stop. And that scooter goes tumbling and your head goes first. And that's the way it just works by physics. If you're on a bicycle, you're sort of in the middle of that contraption, and you can hit a pothole and just be jolted, but it doesn't send you over the handlebars.
So you made some points that we'll follow up on a little bit later, including some of the claims of problems with the scooter's physical components and upkeep and things like that. But focusing back on these lawsuits, something like that could be due to injuries, but also deaths. And there have been deaths from e-scooter use. What have you been able to find out?
I found 7 deaths so far, and just 2 this month in California. So that's as much research as we could do. We found 7, and those usually involved scooters like from Lime and Bird. Those are the 2 largest companies. But there had been a couple off brands, but they were basically the same kind of model. Those are the deaths we've found, and there have been hundreds of serious injuries as far as broken bones and some head trauma. UCLA did a study of two hospitals and their scooter injuries in California, and 40% of the injuries that they saw involved head injuries. They weren't all serious. They weren't all, people knocked unconscious or worse, but they did involve the head.
And so, despite these injuries that you've been talking about, and the less often but still significant 7 deaths that we've just mentioned, it's been difficult to hold anyone accountable other than those who were actually riding the e-scooter at the time due to these agreements everyone must agree to before they get access to a device from any of the major companies. This is something you specifically looked at. Tell me about these agreements.
Well, throughout society in America, we are now compelled to sign user agreements for everything, from using a website to online banking, renting an apartment, almost anything you can imagine. There is some sort of user agreement, and the worst of them require you to surrender most of your legal rights in order to use the product. And that's what goes on with a lot of the e-scooters. The user agreement that I focused on in my reporting was from Lime, which is a California-based company. And their user agreement is 18,404 words. That comes out to about 40 single-spaced pages or 261 screens if you're on a cell phone. Literally no one, 0 people read this. We couldn't find anyone who had ever read it. It was hard to find attorneys who had actually read the entire document. But the user agreement is just a huge problem. One, you've signed it, but 2, if you get hurt, you have very few rights left to you if you've signed that Lime agreement. You've agreed to binding arbitration. You've agreed to never sue them, and even if you did go to arbitration, they would not be responsible for anything over $100. That would be their total exposure. You also agree that Lime has not even suggested, they've not even implied that their equipment is in good shape. You rent that equipment as is. And this presents the problem where, imagine a scooter in a city. It may be ridden 5 times or 20 times in a day. And there could be a problem that the rider doesn't report. So you hop on a scooter that was dumped there 5 minutes ago because it had a brake failure. And the problem doesn't get reported to the company. The company doesn't come to get it and replace it. That could be a situation. Or there's suggestions from a whistleblower now who has used to work for Bird, also a California firm. He has said in a lawsuit that Bird was allowing scooters to go back on the street, which had problems, things like wobbly handlebars and loose screws and missing bolts and things like that, and that he was told by supervisors to deem these to not be damaged. And he said, I won't abide by that. These are damaged. We need to mark them as such and then fix them. And he was fired. He alleges he was fired and for speaking out. So he's got a lawsuit also. So you have a lot of legal problems for the rider. And then if someone were to want to sue, they have to get past that user agreement. And every personal injury lawyer who we spoke to, both in Texas and California, said that will be the big obstacle, that we're going to probably have to prove gross negligence by these companies, which is a legal terminology that almost means you did it on purpose. Certainly means you've been informed that this is malfunctioning and you did nothing. Gross negligence is a hard standard, but it's not even a guarantee in Texas that even that would help you.
So let's focus more on that. In your article available now at expressnews.com, you wrote that attorneys are currently sifting through these injury cases to find ones that they think will have the highest chance of winning in court. What exactly does that mean? Tell me about the process.
Well, most personal injury lawyers work as you might imagine. People just call them out of the blue or contact them online. They tell their story. One of the lawyers in the firm, usually not one of the personalities on TV, but somebody in the staff. Someone interviews you and makes sure that you at least pass the initial test of legitimacy. Drinking alcohol doesn't necessarily disqualify you for a suit like that, but they certainly would be less inclined to take someone who was completely drunk or on drugs. They certainly want to know things about whether you were driving against traffic, were you wearing dark clothing, were you doing anything else that would have contributed to the accident. They want to know all the circumstances. And then if you fit into a certain category, let's say component failure, then you might be good for a class action case where they get everyone who has a similar claim. Those are the generalities of how those cases work.
So we've covered nationally. We've talked about, the legal process that's slowly moving forward, gross negligence, how hard that would be to prove, and how you noted basically means a company may almost have been doing it on purpose. So before we end today's conversation, we, of course, have to talk more about e-scooter use in the San Antonio area. Tell me, what did you find out while researching this article? I know there are certain rules that riders have to follow, but a lot of that's best practices because they're not actually law yet.
Yeah, that's right. In San Antonio, they have permitted almost 14,000 scooters and some bikes. And that doesn't mean that's the number that's actually on the streets. Probably it's half of that, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000. That number changes every day. So that's the number that's been permitted. And in order to get a permit, you have to abide by certain rules. And San Antonio has some rules for riders, but a lot of them are kind of suggestions. For example, they don't require helmets, but they urge you to use a helmet. They have a curfew at night. I think it is 11 o'clock now, and yet you see plenty of people out past 11. What's happened in San Antonio since September of 2018, the San Antonio Fire Department has been keeping statistics on these injuries. And there have been at least 120 since September of last year. And that includes everything, the most serious down to cuts and scrapes, but they all required a 911 call or a 311 call. So somebody thought they were serious enough to at least report. So that's a minimum of 120 because lots of people, if they're hurt, they either don't report it or someone else might take them to the doctor, or it's not bad enough for them to do it right away and they see a doctor later. So that's an absolute minimum of 120. And a lot of those accidents, it's hard not to come to the conclusion that, as a lawyer told me during this story, that we have to make helmets mandatory. Now, this is a controversial subject, and a lot of very well-meaning people will say, we just can't do this. This is too hard to work. But it's not like bicycles, and people should wear them for bikes. But I can understand people not making them mandatory for bikes. But with scooters, it's a different case. First of all, these scooters are they can go they can go up to 15 miles an hour, but certainly can go faster than that downhill. And it's often going downhill that your brakes fail, according to the people who work on these machines. And so the riders really need helmets. And they're running into cars when they trip and fall, when the scooter stumbles and fall. People run into cars. They hit their heads on poles, fire hydrants, curbs, the street itself. They often run into pedestrians. It's a field where you really think, as a governmental entity, these cities need to think about this as not just a recreation issue or a transportation issue. They have to think of this as a public health issue. Let me give you an analogy. If a city permitted me to run a merry-go-round, how long do you think I could stay in business if I had 120 injuries on my merry-go-round since September? I'm sure I wouldn't stay in business after 5 or 10. Word would get out that people had broken their arms on my merry-go-round, and I would be shut down. There would be an investigation of my machinery. Let's change it. Let's say I was permitted to sell snow cones outside the Alamo. Those folks would be inspected. If 120 people got sick, you'd be inspecting all of my equipment for, E. coli and other bacteria, things like that. None of this is happening with scooters because there's this sort of laissez-faire attitude that, they're a missing piece of the transportation puzzle, as they call the first mile and the last mile of transportation. People have to get somewhere in these little short, quick visits and short trips. I get that completely. But there are more injuries than there should be, and the injuries are serious. And there needs to be a way to make those helmets, more easily provided, more quickly provided. And I've seen an idea recently that an attorney proposed on her website, where the rider would actually take a selfie of themselves wearing a helmet, and only after receiving that selfie does the company unlock the bike. The technology is there to do it. I haven't thought it all through, but the technology is there to do it. But somebody's going to have to come up with something creative and not be afraid to be labeled a fuddy-duddy city before this takes off.
And then finally, Bruce, before we say goodbye for today's episode of the In-Depth Podcast, I want to give you a chance for final thoughts, maybe a little food for thought. What effect, if any, do you think your research, your article that you can read now at expressnews.com might have on e-scooter use in San Antonio?
I don't know. I have no idea. Reporters try not to guess what impact their stories will have. The city council in San Antonio is pretty thoughtful. They have good people looking into this. The people who I interviewed said, we're aware of this litigation around the country. We've looked at these suits. They are regularly in touch with Dallas and Houston and Austin, and they know how they're approaching this phenomenon. And I think, San Antonio is in the middle of a 6-month trial program, a pilot program right now with scooters. So that will be over with, I believe, in mid-April. So when that's over with, what they're thinking about doing is producing a concession type model, which they already have with river barges. So they'll have a concession model where they award these contracts to maybe 2 or 3 firms. This is what they've sort of said out loud. And we'd like to narrow I think they have 7 now. They'll narrow this down to 2 or 3. And I think they want to tighten the regulations further, but there does seem to be some resistance to making helmets mandatory. And I don't know if I'd call it really resistance, but I'm not sure they're willing to go as far as some proposed California legislation, which is going to ban any user agreement that takes away your fundamental legal rights. So I'm not sure the council is going that far, though I know there is at least one city councilman, Manny Pelaez, who is sympathetic towards that and is really offended by these user agreements. So I think that's where they're headed, but I can't predict how regulatory they want to get.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News staff writer Bruce Selcraig for joining me for today's episode of the In-Depth Podcast, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.